Thanks for coming. My name is Toby Mueller. I'm the library director here. I'll just say a couple of words of welcome. I just want to, first of all, acknowledge that we're here tonight living our lives on unceded Chatelaine territory. I'm very grateful to work for an organization that takes our responsibility to build a better future seriously. And an event like this is actually part of that, I feel, because when Laurel first got in touch and said that Gord would like to come and read it here, I was pretty delighted. And then when I read his book, I was really excited because it's a really delightful and different perspective on our community's history. From a child's point of view, for one thing, and yeah, just some really different stories that I've never heard before. And I think hearing different kinds of stories is really important. So thanks for being here. We are going to film it, and Gord has gracefully given permission for us to put it on our YouTube channel for a month. So if you enjoy this evening, spread the word, and people can go and watch it later, people who didn't want to come tonight. So without further ado, I don't feel I have to introduce Mr. Whitney very much because that's what his book does, and I look forward to hearing you. Thank you for coming.
Do you think I need this?
Yes, you do.
I really need a microphone.
I can hold it for you if you don't want to hold it.
I can try. Well, Eleanor Webster's son sits right over there, and Eleanor and I were competitors in high school all the way through, especially in science class. We fought for the highest mark all the time. And I remember meeting his father and mother in Vancouver once. But I was very lucky. I was very lucky that I loved school. I loved everything. I loved white chalk and colored chalk, and I even loved cleaning those brushes for the teacher after school. And eventually I started out as a geological engineer. For 3 years, I quit and became a mathematics teacher. And that was the smartest move I ever made. But I remember every stick and stone in Lillooet, but also, well, moreover, Cayuse Creek became my favorite place to be. I spent a lot of time fishing down there, talking to an old friend who became my favorite uncle, you might say, Tom Mance. I don't know if you've ever met him. But those two items in my memory have stuck with me all these years. When I was 92, my daughter asked me to write down the stories, because I would tell these stories. Some of them are quite vicious, some of them are quite sweet and loving, and some of them are very dramatic, and some of them are just ramblings of what we did. I remember one winter, some of us made a big snowball and rolled it in through the Seeing Long store in the middle of winter, and melted against the stove, and we ran away and exulted on crying. It was a very brave thing to do, a stupid thing to do. Actually, Lillooet was quite racist, you know. It was, we called the Chinese people chinks. You know, we would have it was a rhyme, when Chinky Chinky Chinaman sitting on the rail, along came the train and cut off his tail, things like that. But I was lucky, I was raised, you might say, with two Chinese families, the Wing family and the Jim family. But my favorite memories are of Cayuse Creek and my dear grandmother. I used to go down there on the weekends when I was 2 years old, 3 or 4 years old, and Granny would look after me, and at nighttime in the summertime, she would say, let's sleep outside, you know, let's look at the stars. So Grandma would be on one side, she'd be on the other, and I on my cot in between them. And I remember there were no mosquitoes, because uptown, when Eleanor was suffering from mosquitoes, there was a breeze down Seton Creek and Cayuse Creek, and there were no mosquitoes, and they couldn't fly against the current. So that was a precious part of my memory. And as a result, I want to remember that I wrote a little poem, maybe I can recite it to you now, about that little situation when I was with my granny looking up in the sky.
Are you going to read it from your phone?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll try to remember it. You'll have to excuse me if I forget because I'm an old man now.
You've got to start again.
Well, anyway, when I was 2, sleeping under summer skies, I thought the stars were singing sweet lullabies to me when I was 2. And when I was 3, someone said to me, those weren't stars, those were only crickets. When you get older, you will see. When I was 3. And when I was 4, I knew that male crickets sang sweet love songs to shy female crickets hiding under stones when I was 4. And now that I am old, I gaze with wonder up at the stars, and I yearn to be 2 again. I was wiser then by far.
So Dad recently had some minor surgery
Yeah.
on his eyelid.
I had a droopy eyelid. Now it's only half droopy.
So we're going to read some parts of a few of the stories tonight, and he's asked me to do the reading because he's not 100% sure about his reading yet. So the first one is one of the first stories, which is called A Child's Winter in Lillooet. And today we went over to the streets to see what the streets are called now. So this story is set at the intersection of 7th Avenue and Main. But in Dad's day, they called 7th Avenue Egan's Alley.
That was the postmistress.
And my dad's family was renting a house near there, and in his day they called it the Back Lane, but now his street is called Fraser View Street. Okay. These dried up gullies became our wintertime sliding slopes, our dips, as we called them. Big Dip and Little Dip were both located near the site of the town's present-day public library. We iced these slopes to the desired degree of slipperiness by carrying pails of water from Mr. Hurley's basement tap or an indoor tap in the school and pouring the water on the snow-packed slopes. We made primitive luges from cardboard boxes, flattened or unflattened, and some of the older boys even went down the slopes on ice skates. The first sliders to arrive at the site after school or after supper would build a bonfire using wood and scraps of paper brought from home. We all brought spuds to roast in the fire. It was a real pioneer pleasure to break open those blackened nuggets and fill our mouths with hot, fluffy, cooked potato starch. And the fire was necessary to warm us up, so we could go on sliding until it was time to go home. Safety was always on our minds, and the dips were safe from automobile traffic, such as there was in back alleys and on Main Street. But boys being boys, we didn't always take our parents' warnings seriously. One winter, several of us decided to ride our sleds down Egan's Alley, across Main Street, and past Larder's Garage, now the Esso station. If we were lucky, we'd slide across the PGE railroad tracks and down the steep, winding road to Mrs. Foster's farm. This farm no longer exists, having been used for housing lots. Sledding down Egan's Alley was a very dangerous activity that necessitated having one boy stand as lookout at the junction of Egan's Alley and Main Street. This was okay during daylight hours when a lookout could wave and warn of oncoming cars, but at night it became hazardous. To avoid accidents, we used 2 flashlights, one with red crepe paper covering the lens, and the other with green. We would rush to the alley right after school and continue sledding until dark. On one such evening, around 5 o'clock, we curtailed our sledding and our ranks thinned as mothers called children home to supper. Bobby Hurley left, Clifford Jim left, and the Larder twins left. Georgie Hurley, who lived right on the alley, had gone inside, and Boyo Hurley and I were the only 2 left. I could hear my mother calling me. At that time, we lived close to the alley in a rented house across from Blanche Vinyl's present home. I was holding the flashlights because at the moment, I was the lookout. Boyo had just come back from a successful slide, towing his sled behind him, having made it down Egan's Alley, past Larder's garage, and down past Blanche Vinyl's place. But it was supper time, and besides, it had started to snow again, quite heavily. I told Boyo we had to quit for the night. I reminded him that his kid brother Bobby had gone home, and that he was supposed to go home too. I remember him saying, "Okay," as I headed for home, ducking my head against the falling snow and taking the 2 flashlights with me. A short time later, as I was getting ready to sit down to supper, there was a knock on our door, and a breathless voice said there had been an accident. Boyo Hurley, sledding down Egan's Alley, had ridden into the right front wheel of Bill Arthur's car as Bill headed westward up Main Street. I'll stop there.
That was one of my favorite
Hold it up by your...
one of my favorite young friends, Boyle. And I guess you never get over there. I still suffer from his death. But we did stupid things. We used to swim in the Fraser River when it was not safe, and when it froze over, we could skate on it. But we like to risk our lives, especially in Cayuse Creek and Seton Creek. We did a lot of fishing, and I remember one time I stepped on a slippery log and I landed. I don't think I even had the strength to scream at that time. But the sweet memories outdo the bad memories.
We picked that story to begin with because I think all of us as children growing up in Canada have experiences like that with how we quite independently organize our winter activities, and then our parents usually consent to what we're doing, but of course when we're not being supervised all the time, we have to take responsibility or take risks. And also I think all of us from our childhood have a kind of a geography of our childhood, where certain streets or street corners or buildings are what our memory kind of lives in that geography. And so for us as children coming here with my dad and mom would bring us to Lillooet pretty well every year in the summer. My dad would show us all of those places that were meaningful to him. And so we as kids developed an attachment to those places because he would take us there and he would tell us a lot of these stories, which he eventually wrote down. Yeah, when a lot of the book talks about fishing, because my dad became a very good fisher.
I was the best one in Lillooet.
Yeah, by the time he was about 8 years old. So maybe you want to talk about that.
Well, my older brother, Ernie and Alan, taught me to fish when I was 8 years old. And the first fish I caught was a grayling, and it looked so ugly I screamed, and they ran down from where they were standing and thought I'd fallen in the water. But I had an advantage caused by that. I was born with astigmatism, where everything was blurry. And when I fished, we'd cut a pole, a Saskatoon tree, make it our own fishing pole, and wind the fishing line around it, and then put on a piece of leader and a hook, and get grasshoppers for bait. And I tried to do what the other boys did, but put the line in the water and watch the hook. But I couldn't see the hook, so I said to myself, watch the line, stupid, watch the line. When the line twitches, a fish is putting its mouth around the bait. So that's how I fished, and I caught fish after fish after fish. One time I went down to Texas Creek when I was about 9 years old with my grandfather. He had a job at Dickey Ranch down there, and Mrs. Dickey said, "Gordy, I hear you're a good fisherman." I said, "Yeah, I am." And she said, "Well, look, I have got a bit of crew here today. Go down to Texas Creek and catch us some fish." And I went down and fished for an hour and a half, and I got 101 fish. Because nobody fished Texas Creek in those days. But nowadays, you're lucky if you can catch a 6-inch fish. And then when I got older, Tom Manson, my wonderful friend Tom Manson, taught me how to catch big ling cod in the Fraser River. And then some other people now, they still do, they have a sturgeon contest. They catch, but I never fished for big fish. I was happy catching 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-inch trout, dipping them in flour and frying them in bacon fat. Great.
And so as Gordon said at the beginning tonight, that the stories the book is bittersweet because some of the stories are about tragedies and other stories are whimsical. And I guess for us being his children, because he always told us stories, especially when we were driving all those hours in the car to get up here from where we lived in South Burnaby, he told us that he usually was hungry during the dirty 30s, the Great Depression, and that there wasn't enough food at home for him. But he also told us that he was able to catch fish, and so he had a lot of protein, and he often gave fish away or traded it with other people. So I guess as children, the kind of the trauma of poverty was sweetened by those kinds of stories where we could see how resilient he was and how he solved those problems for himself. So this next story that I'm going to read a little bit from is called Mrs. Wing Naturopath. So one of the things when I was helping my dad put all the stories together in a collection, one of the things I asked him was, well, what about the experience of women who were there at the time that you were there? And I said, what are some of the women that were important people in the community? And he said, oh, it's Mrs. Wing. She was a self-taught medicine woman.
She was a flathead Indian woman.
And he said she became the poor man's doctor because there were 2 doctors in the town. One of them was not allowed to really practice. And the other one, my dad says, was kind of a snob who favored the more wealthy people in the town. So he said that Mrs. Wing was a hero for him because she was the person that most people would go to, and especially his family. So this is a story about the connection between his family and Mrs. Wing. I'm bleeding, run, go get Mrs. Wing. It was mid-morning in July 1933. The words came from the tent house in which my mother, unknown to me at the moment, was lying on a blood-soaked sheet on a bed in the temporary accommodation where she and my father slept. We had just moved back to Lillooet after our stint in Goldbridge. This time my father had been offered a job building a house on a subdivided lot in town. The owner of the half lot, a Mr. Wo Hing, we called him Young Wo Hing because his father was known as Old Wo Hing, had promised a lower than usual fee for building but free rent in perpetuity. My father sent a detailed plan for the building and asked the owner to have a portion of the lot bulldozed to the correct size for the foundation to be poured into place. We pitched 2 tents on a corner of the bulldozed leveled ground. We moved our belongings, beds, table, stove, etc., into the 2 tents. In other words, we camped out there for 1 month while my father quickly framed the house, shingled the roof and the exterior walls, put in windows and doors, and paneled the interior walls with 6-inch wide V-joint cedar. I was 8 years old, and I'd already gotten out of my sleeping bag in my small pup tent and made my own breakfast in the cook tent, using our portable Coleman camp stove to boil the water. My mother's scream galvanized me. I put my porridge bowl on the folding table outside my tent, ran to the tent house door, and peeked in. I saw my mother lying on her bed, her voice weakening as she said, "Hurry, oh, hurry, get Mrs. Wing, oh, hurry." I'm going, Mum," I shouted. "I'm going to get her." My mother moaned her assent. I sped through the gate, down the dips, and up the other side, running with my heart in my mouth across the back alley, through the gate and onto the Wing family's front porch. I pounded on their front door. Katie Wing and her sister Jessie Wing opened the door as I blurted out, "Come quick, my mom's bleeding to death." "Oh my God," screamed Katie. "Nina's having a miscarriage. Get the stretcher, Jessie, and follow me. Be quick, be quick. Nina's hemorrhaging."
Oh. My mother had 9 pregnancies, and she lost 4 of them. So there were 5 of us that survived. And I think a lot of women in Lillooet suffered some of the same thing. But the Wing, Mrs. Wing, was a very wise lady, but she herself had 14 children that lived in Lillooet. And she was very kind to me, and I remember as we ate in the restaurant and they blew the wheat, one of the girls, Jessie, used to always cook pies in the summertime, and she would call me and her younger brother Georgie, and she'd yell, "Come on, I've got apricot pie for you guys." And we would go in and have delicacies like that. And I got to know every member in the family, and I remember the father was a communist who escaped from China, came to Lillooet, and I know that Mrs. Wing was a Flathead Indian, but she was very skilled indeed. And so I spent a lot of my time with that family, and then the Jim family that lived on the front street of the store. I became a favorite member of their family, and we were together over the years, just like I met your aunt and mother. I've met these people down at the coast before, and talked about the old tragedies and all the old sweet memories. And so, I think if you read the book, you'll see why Lillooet still today, in my old age, fascinates me. I just can't stop thinking about it and want to tell you all about it.
So as one of Gordon's children, we realized, I guess, how resilient he was and enterprising as a child, because he told us many times that most days after school, he would end up at the Jim family home. And he would help the Jim kids with their homework because he was such a good student. And then they would invite him for dinner. And so that was one more way that he was filling his belly and wasn't suffering so much, because he knew that in his house there probably wasn't any food on the table. And so he kind of got adopted into the Jim family home. And the story about Mrs. Wing ends telling a true event, that everything is true actually in all these stories. A typhoid outbreak that happened where my dad and his father caught typhoid, and it talks about some of the hypocrisy in the town and how Mom Murray hushed up the true source of the typhoid and blamed the Whitneys. Yeah, blame, because my dad and his father got typhoid, so blame the victims. But in fact, some people had knowledge about who really had brought typhoid to the town, and it was a city person who was a friend of Mom Murray.
And then, look, I admire Mom Murray. She owned the Bridge River Lillooet News, and her husband was a Liberal member of the legislature. But she and her husband had a habit of inviting strangers to come into Lillooet to take certain jobs. And one job was the head of the government, what do you call it? The government yard down here, where they kept all the equipment. And I can't remember this name, but his name escaped me. But at this junction of Seton Creek and Cayuse Creek, they had a shack built there. They lived in it, the uncle and his son. And they constructed a toilet that infected the river. So downstream, I was the first one. I remember coming up from the creek, falling down, being carried into the house, and then the taxi called, taken on the way to Lytton, and my father followed a day later. And I think a few other people in town got it. But here was this young man allowed. The inspectors came up and tested and sampled the creek, and they found that he was a typhoid carrier. Well, when I was in Lytton Hospital, I could have been a carrier, so they kept testing me, and I spent 2 months in it. I remember one strange thing happened to me. I lost all my hair. So I look good now, but in those days, I was bald for a couple of months.
Okay, we've chosen one other story to read from, and then we want to open it up more for discussion, and I think some of you can probably share some of your experiences too. So this story is about the next door neighbor. One of the homes that my dad's family rented was right on Main Street. It's now the Jade House. So if you look at the Jade House carefully, you can see there's a house inside it, but it's being...
Just see the peak.
Yeah, it's being covered up by the actual storefront. And where the Legion is, which is next to the Jade House, is where a neighbor whose name was Giuseppe Pizzi lived.
Joe Pizzi.
And yeah, local people called him Joe Pizzi. "That's a maega you got in your basket," shouted Mr. Pizzi, leaning on our back fence one Saturday morning. My brother Ernie, deliberately standing in plain view in our backyard, tipped forward so that Mr. Pizzi could see inside the basket of chicken eggs he was holding. Joe Pizzi, as we called him, really Giuseppe, or Joseph in Italian, had come from Italy in 1919 and settled into the Lillooet community where his cousin Gino Santini had come before the First World War. Joe spoke broken English with a strong accent that added an A, O, I, or E sound to the end of most words. Because most Italian words end in a vowel, Italian is a lovely language for opera. I think it is the most beautiful sounding language of all. The night before, my brother Ernie had secretly sneaked 24 eggs into our kitchen from our grandmother's chicken farm on the Cayuse Flats, where she raised 600 laying hens. Early the next morning, he waited until Mr. Pizzi was up and out in his own backyard, and at the right moment, he came out of the barn and shouted to Mr. Pizzi, "Look how many eggs I found in our barn this morning." "That's a not you egga," shouted Mr. Pizzi, leaning heavily on our fence. "That's a my egga." No, Mr. Pizzi," replied Ernie. "Those eggs were laid in our barn, and anything we find in our barn belongs to us. I check each day, Mr. Pizzi, and I get a lot of fresh eggs." "But you got a no chickie," said Mr. Pizzi angrily. "How can you get egga when you got a no chickie?" "That's a my egga. My chickie, he lay egga in your barn. Well, Ernie asked, what are your chickens doing in our barn? Why don't they stay in their own yard? You have a big yard. Chickie look for food, that's what chickie do, shouted Mr. Pizza. Chickie like to eat the bug. Yeah, said Ernie. They come into our yard looking for bugs because you let them. And we are tired of stepping in the shit from your chickens. You should keep your chickens in your own yard. Look at our good strong picket fence. It was built to keep out cows and horses, not chickens. Chickens can squeeze right through the pickets. Why don't you pen your chickens up? You let them wander everywhere and they come into our yard and shit all over the place. Maybe you don't give your chickens enough to eat. Maybe they get hungry and come over into our backyard looking for grasshoppers. And when the chickens get full of our grasshoppers, they have to go poo-poo. Why don't you fix your fence? Mr. Pizzi retorted. So my chickie never gonna come to your place.
Actually, I learned to love that old man and his wife later on. He was very kind to me. I guess he did connect me with my older brother's egg trick. And we used to have, he had a special apple tree that had a water core was infected with a virus, and it was so sweet. And I would go and say to him, Mr. Pizzi, can I get apples? He'd say, sure, you take a lot home, and your mama make a good apple pie for you. And we did that. He was always giving us food, and his wife would come out with a pair of scissors to cut grapes off the grapevine. And later in his career, he took the sidle behind that house of his, and he trenched it, and he turned it into a vineyard. And he didn't sell the wine to people. He treated them at Christmas time. Everybody got drunk at Joe Pizzi's place at Christmas.
And actually how this story winds up is when my dad meets my mom and proposes to her and marries her, he brings her up to Lillooet, and he takes her to Joe Pizzi's house. And my mom enjoyed meeting the Pizzis and enjoyed visiting his garden. So it's obvious in the story that Mr. Pizzi and my dad became very good friends. But the older brother, Ernie, was the brother that my dad looked up to, and Ernie had to shoulder a lot of responsibility in the family. So a lot of the stories are about Ernie's antics, as witnessed by younger brother Gordon.
And I had, by the time I took my wife Joanne to Lillooet, in 1955, Joe Pizzi's wife Louisa had passed on. And I knocked on the door and he threw his arms around me. And he said, come in, sit down. So we went in and sat down, and he said, after we had some of his wine, etc., he said, something I got to show you. I don't show this to many people, but you. And he went and he got a little box and opened it up, and there was a silk tie, and he said, my wife, if she buy this for me the day we married, he said, and I saved it all of this time. He said, and I said, oh, it's so beautiful, Mr. Pizzi. I'm proud to be your friend. And I think that Joe lived for another 4 or 5 years and died in Victoria, where one of his daughters shouted him. But then his grave is now in the cemetery here. And Tom Manson told me that, he said, you should go and say goodbye to them. So my wife and I went in and we saw their graves side by side. Louisa and Joe, Giuseppe. I still remember those friends of mine. Every month or so, I think about the cemetery. We drove past it the other day. We should go in and see them before we go home.
Yep. So Toby told me when we came in tonight that she's read the whole book already. So we wanted to open it up for questions or comments or discussion. We want you to also be part of this event. And so no questions are not good questions. Anything that you want to ask about his experience or what he's written in the stories, or any topic that you want him to talk about?
And
Like
I might make up an answer that's not even in the book.
he already mentioned racism.
Oh, yes.
Right? Yes.
I just know that you said you're down by the river quite a lot, and was that before the dam was built? Probably. And what was the river like at that time?
Which river?
The Cayush.
Oh, the Cayush was almost the same volume it is now, but your town has flooded with visitors and flooded with people who like to fish and go down, and so now you're lucky if you catch a little fish. But there was also the annual spawning time when we would go down, and you could almost walk across on the backs of sockeye salmon.
Well, what Dad has told us is that after the dam was built, which was after his time, because he moved to New Westminster when he was 14, his dad got work because the war broke out in 1939, or the war was going to break out, and so the government was gearing up, and so his dad was offered a job in New Westminster, and they left when he was 14. And then he started coming back later when he was an adult. He told us that especially Seton Lake changed a lot because of the dam, so the temperature of the water. So the lake that he has a beautiful story in here about the kids, the local kids swimming at Seton Lake. And the lake he's describing, he told us, is not what we experienced when we came up in the 60s as young children, because the hydro dam changed things
Well, can
so
I
much.
enlarge on that? When your mother and all your families now, when we went out to the lake, it was warm. You could swim in it. And then Mr. Downton, an engineer, he knew the potential behind Bridge River, so they built a dam at Bridge River, and they built a tunnel through Mushinong and dumped this ice-cold glacial water into Seton Lake and ruined it for swimming. And then to add to that, they went and dammed Cayush Creek, and they built a tunnel and they put, you can still see today, cold Cayush water coming in. And so the lake, I think the people here have lost a wonderful asset, because that lake used to be our feature in the summertime. When the sun went down over the ridge behind town, you could go out and swim in a hot summer weather until 9 o'clock when the sun went down behind Seton Lake. So I regret that happened. One of my friends from Croatia was a person who swam I think he was an Olympic contender. We came one summer, he and I were doing some hiking around here and fishing. And we went to the wharf at Seton Lake, and he said, I'm going to go for a swim. I said, Pete, don't jump in that water. He said, why? I said, it's too cool. He said, I swam in the Danube when I was a boy. I'm used to it. Go ahead. I said, go ahead. Well, he went and ran off and did a somersault and landed in the water. And he came up screaming. He said, you're right.
Somebody else? Yes.
Gordon, my name's Vivian, and I was so pleased more than a decade ago. Ian's Aunt Jean put us in touch, and you provided me with some stories that I read on Radio Lillooet, actually. And I'm wondering, one that I remember is about some unusual baking ingredients for the donut. And I'm hoping that story is in your book.
Oh?
It is. It's the last story. The edit, we hired a lovely young woman, Amanda, to help edit this. And we really struggled with what to do with that story. Because it actually, my dad heard that story later from Bill, who my dad met in the Lower Mainland, but Bill had been a baker here during the war. And so my dad wasn't here anymore, but he heard the story from Bill, and then he wrote that story, and so we decided to put it as the last story in the book.
Well, during the war, Bill couldn't get certain ingredients, and they liked him to make donuts, but he said, I can't get cooking oil. Well, one of the old-timers who lived up, Gus Strom, lived up on the top flat there, he said, Bill, don't you worry, I got lots of mineral oil I give to you. Bill said, don't. He took me to me, we can't use mineral oil. He said, I fry my egg in a mineral oil, I cook them in. So anyway, he didn't know that, Gus didn't know and didn't care, I guess, that this was a laxative. So, Bill started making the donuts in desperation. He couldn't get the supplies during the war, and then people were happy to see the donuts there in the window. And they came in and they bought, well, they all had diarrhea. And all the paper in the town disappeared. Even Ma Murray's newspaper was used. And so, when Bill told me the story, I had to just write about it. I called it the donut story. But it's, there was an aside to that the man that, Burns man that brought up the lard, etc., explained to Bill that he could get him some oil if Bill would teach him to play the piano. So that's what happened, you see. Swap piano music for good donuts.
When Gordon said that he is very attached to Cayuse Creek, he didn't mention that the last home that he had in Lillooet was a shack that his father built on the shores of Cayuse Creek. So up until that time, they'd always rented homes that belonged to somebody else. But finally, his dad built a shack, and essentially they were squatters. But since nobody wanted to live right on the rocky edge of Cayuse Creek, they didn't have any trouble with it. And so when we were kids growing up, it would always be that shack in Cayuse Creek that he would talk about how cold it was to go to bed in the winter, and how pleasant it was in the summer.
I slept with my dog.
And some of the stories in the book are about his favorite times that he remembers playing with other children along the shores of Cayuse Creek, or fishing expeditions that he went on by himself or just with another friend, where they started off fishing on Cayuse Creek. So his attachment to Cayuse Creek, I think, is also because of living there. And when they moved to New Westminster, he says that after a few months, he really missed Cayuse Creek. And he started to really miss Lillooet the longer that he got accustomed to living in New Westminster, the more he started to understand, he was 14 years old, that he had left a very special place, and that he was far away from there now.
So where was the shack in Cayuse Creek?
What?
We actually went to photograph the spot today. So it's, you know where the mill is? It's really close to where the mill is. So if you stood against the wall of the mill and you just walked to the edge of the water, somewhere between the mill's wall and the water, that's where the shack was.
It was carried away in the 1948 flood, and I saw it floating by Hope one day.
But also his grandmother and grandfather, their farm was also in that same area, close to where the mill is today. Their farm was right against the bank. So it was kind of a logical place, I guess, for his dad to build a shack, because his grandparents actually did own a piece of property there where they had a little farm.
And the water we carried from the creek was one time contaminated with typhus, see? That's how I got it. But it's, the latest flood I read in Miyazaki's book took away all the property, including my grandparents' farm, etc., and the Miller family that lived next door. And the only part that was left was Wilbert Whitney's shack or home at the bottom of Station Hill. So he was pretty wise. He knew the water would get the rest of us. He was safe.
And the book contains, my dad's also a very talented visual artist. When he finished his career as a math teacher, he went to Langara College Art School and did the 2-year full-time diploma in visual arts. And so there's for example, there's a sketch of a cabin here So the cabin to him is a reminder of the Cariboo, but he says this cabin is much more luxurious than the shack that they lived in. So some of the things in the book, like he's got a map of the 5 blocks of Main Street that he remembers as a child. So he's named every house with the family name. And so there are things like that in the book as well.
We passed your grandfather's house, Webb's house. He was in charge of the water supply for the town, and he used to get my father to go up, and I would go with Dad, and he'd clean all the screens, etc. And then he got my father to go and help, well, work for a lady across the street, was called the talking machine, Campbell, yeah. And oh, she was so generous, and he made enough money to buy a Model T Ford and try to escape Lillooet and get down to Vancouver. We didn't quite make it. We came back, and of course he moved out of the Wohing house, so he took some of the money to make with Mrs. Campbell, talking machine Campbell, and he built the shack. It only took him a couple of days, but it was a tar paper shack, and it was terrible in wintertime to live in. But I liked it because I was close to my beautiful Cayuse Creek. Still inside me is Cayuse Creek. I don't know, I think it was from a Spanish name, Cayuse, meaning horse, I'm not sure. But the language changes from environment to environment, and we call it Cayuse Creek.
And another thing that people who are reading the book and talking to us are talking about is my dad was trained to be a geologist. He went to UBC, so he has a very good understanding of this region and of the history, the geological history, and how different formations were formed, mountains, lakes, glaciers, the story of the railroad, and how the original designers of the railroad didn't understand the local geology and geography, and they made a huge mistake that later had to be corrected, and that's why Lillooet actually has 2 different places where the railway station was and now where it stands today. So in sort of from a BC history perspective, the stories are very rich in the information they teach you in an entertaining way about this place that you're living in, because it is a very rich place, right? It's I think most people who just come to Lillooet, even if they only come to visit for one day, one of the things they talk about is how striking the setting is. It's really a unique place in that way.
It's full of housing now. It's just, I don't even recognize it. When we drive up, I remember when we drove up like Glacier Canyon and looked at it, you could see a little town with a few houses. Now there are houses everywhere. And there must be how many people? 2,500 people in the town?
Yeah.
And there were 700 when I was a boy. Well, 701, including me.
Yes.
Did you go to school in the one-room schoolhouse?
Yes, I started grade 1 in that school. Then and grade 1 and 2, and then we moved for a winter to Goldbridge, where my dad was operating the snowplow, and I spent grade 4 in that school. I loved it because the lady there, Miss Harris, was Welsh, and she taught us the Welsh national anthem. Men of Arctic in the hollow, can you reap like the rushing billow? Wave on wave of surgents follow, battle's distant sound. When I came back at 8 years of age, I went into grade 5.
So one of the themes of the story is that the teachers in his school skipped him ahead because he was a very good student. But as he grew older, he came to regret that because being the smallest boy made him a social misfit.
I have to say something here. Eleanor was 3 years older than I was. And all those beautiful girls with burgeoning bodies were there, and here I was, a prepubescent boy, and I fell in love with a lot of them. And one in particular, Hazel Arthur. I think I once tried to hold her hand. She rejected me. Anyway, I got even with her because I wrote a story about her where it's called Fishing, and she chases me and wants to learn how to fish, and she actually teaches me how to kiss and all those kinds of things. So I love that story because I got even with Hazel in the last one.
Yeah, so Amanda, the editor, who is a trained historian, she asked me, she said, this one story about Hazel Arthur, she said, I just don't think it's true. and I said, oh, you're right, Amanda, not all of it is true. And she said, oh my goodness, my historian side tells me we're in trouble. And I said, no, Amanda, you just have to keep it in the book because Dad's requesting that it be in the book. But he wrote a little rider at the beginning of it saying that he had actually compiled different females he knew when he was at that age into this one character, and set it in this one. I got even. One day where they went fishing. Yes. Yes.
I'm going to take off my mask and be loud enough, but when I read the book, I felt like it really had very much the gaze of a child. And do you feel that just happened because of your memories, or did you do that on purpose when you were writing? No, I guess I embroidered a lot, but these memories, I've always remembered Lillooet, and the memories just welled up from inside me, but sure, I invented a lot. I think that I read enough short stories to see that invention could improve a situation that was just ordinary. And for example, the Hazel Arthur story, it was, I suppose, natural for me to want to associate with these girls that I spent every day in school with. But I think they rejected me for two reasons. I was too young and I was too smart.
Well, actually, Toby, the editor and I were really impressed with his voice. We called it his voice. And I think the way I would answer your question is, all my life, what I've heard is that even though it was the Depression and he sometimes didn't have enough food, he really loved his childhood. And so that's a part of his life that is precious to him. And I think we can understand that if you're skipped ahead 3 years in school, as soon as you hit puberty, things become more complicated. But by then, he had moved to New Westminster. So Lillooet is his childhood because the Lillooet chapter of his life ended when his childhood actually ended.
1939, the war broke out.
Yeah, but if he wanted to be in a writer's workshop, I think it would be really great for him to be part of a group who are learning how to write and getting a coach, because I think his voice is one of the best aspects of his writing, and a coach could probably even get more of it out of him. As I know Amanda and I, we were so careful. We didn't change anything about his voice.
Well, BS in academia stands for Bachelor of Science, but in my case it stood for something worse than that.
No, we had to do a lot of fact checking. I mean, Amanda, especially because she's trained to be a historian. So we did a lot of fact checking. So we feel very good about the integrity of the facts in the book. And sometimes when people ask me, what is unique about this book, I say, well, it's a social justice perspective. So a lot of books that are about the past are written by the conquerors or the elite people who had an easy life. But this book is written from the ground up, from somebody who represents the struggling people, the working class, and even people who didn't have jobs at all. And so it's the underdog perspective on growing up in Lillooet. And I think that's one of the things it contributes, because I did a little bit of research, and a lot of the, so-called pioneer stories in BC are written by people who were relatively wealthy. And their view, their say is what gets recorded in writing. And so I think it's really refreshing that Gordon's point of view is so,
This is the
so
real
different.
truth here. This is the real stuff.
So different from that.
But Lillooet still is fascinating to me. I love this place. And I love Cayuse Creek, and I love Texas Creek, and I love my family. But there's no doubt about it, it was a powerful social mix we had here. I remember when I was fishing on Cayuse Creek in 1933, a group of hobos came up on the PG and disembarked. Somebody told them that Lillooet was a good place. So they set up camp near the foot of Station Hill. And I used to pass their camp. One day they were making donuts and they saw me with a string of 6 fish I used to make a stick, and would string my fish on it with that. Anyway, and one of them called me over and he said, "How would you like to try one of our donuts?" So I said, "Can you?" So he gave me one. He said, "Look, you give me your 7 fish, I'll give you 7 donuts." They were just making donuts in a lard pail. So that was the first time I tasted city food.
But actually, what we were told as children is that my dad was an activist in the CCF and the NDP in like Burnaby and East Vancouver, and we were told that a lot of his socialist ideals came from those conversations with the hobos. The hobos were the unemployed men, right, who were riding the rails, and actually his older brothers were very influenced. And so him being the younger brother, one of the younger brothers in the family, he was listening to a lot of these conversations about politics and about the Depression and about the Civil War that broke out in Spain and then about Hitler. And so to us kids, it made sense that he became a socialist because he was trading fish for donuts with the hobos.
I don't know if any of you remember the name Tom Manson. Did anyone hear of Tom Manson?
I heard the name.
Well, he was a wonderful man. I think I adopted him as a substitute father. And he told me so many things. And one thing he told me, when I used to play with Bobby Hurley, who was from a rich family, and I was never invited into their house, etc. And I was complaining one time to Tom when he went by on the main street. He'd stop if we were playing, and I'd go over and talk to him. And he said, "Gordon," he said, "don't say anything bad to any of these children because they're all related," he said, "and you will have a tough time, so keep your lips sealed." And I didn't realize that Tom had 2 daughters living, probably 2 sisters living this time. I don't know if you've heard of the Reed family, Francis Reed. Anyway, he came over, he was a colonel, I think, in the British Army, Colonel Manson, and he lived down on an equivalent spot to where Mrs. Foster had me. At the end of the bridge, when you come across there, that property was Tom's big orchard. His father was a big game guy. And I'm sure that Tom was just unlucky in that he never got married, he never had children. And I was a nosy kid, and I pestered him to teach me how to fish. And that began a friendship that lasted for a long, long time. And the last time I saw Tom was when I brought my wife to visit. We went down to his place, and he came out of his house and said, "Guess what happened today?" I said, "What happened, Tom?" He said, "I'm 87. And then 8 years later, when he's my age, he passed away from kidney failure.
And that goes back to the childhood voice. I think my dad was very lucky because he hung around with adults like Tom Manson, and a lot of his knowledge came from those adults. So for example, there's a story here about Frank Gott, who was executed extrajudicially by the wildlife officer. Frank Bott was a veteran, an Indigenous award-winning veteran from World War I who was caught poaching. And that story has been told many times. I talked to Wendy Fraser, the former editor of the newspaper, and she's done a lot of research on it. And my dad's able to tell that story because he heard it from Tom Manson.
Well, I went downtown one night, no, it was about 5 o'clock, not one night, and I saw a truck parked and people crowded around it. And I headed over to it. Tom Manson was there. He said, don't go there. Don't go there. I said, what? He said, well, Frank, God's body's on there. I said, what happened? And he explained that Frank was, Bert Ferry, the game warden, was after Frank because Frank was always shooting deer for the poor Indian families that he knew. And I guess just the idea that he was breaking the law inflamed Frank Ferry's mind, and he tried to catch Frank Bert Ferry tried to catch Frank in the act. Well, one time he did. And the story was, I don't know if this actually was truly what happened, but anyway, somebody said, Bert Ferry must have caught Frank with a deer out of season on his pack horse, and he called him, Frank, stop, I want to see what you got on that horse. And Frank, who was a sniper in the First World War, he said, if you go near that horse, I'm going to shoot you. Well, the story goes on that Frank who did what he said he's going to do, because Bert Ferry died with a bullet right here, bang. And of course, this story inflamed the people in Lillooet, and they formed a posse, and they tracked him down, and they actually, on his horse, they shot him off his horse, and he bled to death. And that's what I saw in this truck in the main street. And Tom Manson said, "Don't go there. You don't. No, stay away." And I tried to get somebody to tell me about it, and finally I heard the story from one of the wing boys that told me. And it's too bad because he was doing a good thing for the town. There are plenty of deer. And if you kill a few deer out of season, who cares? But he was actually told on by a couple of Indigenous, a man and his son were in the area, and they knew that what had happened. And I guess they felt badly afterwards because they had actually squealed on Frank Bott. And I regret that people were like that, but the town was prejudiced against Indigenous people, Chinese people, and during the Second World War, Eastern Flat over the East Lillooet was populated by Japanese. Shalath was populated, and that's how you got your number one citizen, Miyazaki. He was a brilliant doctor, brilliant surgeon. And you read some of it, if you get his book, My 60 Years in Canada, you'll just be shocked at the chances he took to serve his patients. He'd ride on horseback, go across the ferry, and even in snowy weather, he was always there. And when they did form a hospital group in Shalath, the women there would still come to Lillooet to have their babies with Miyazaki. Because I don't know, he had the kind of personality that made you love him, you trusted him. Of course, he was a skilled surgeon, but not trained in Canada. They didn't train Japanese. He would have to go to the United States and get his degree. But to my mind, he was a brilliant man. I honor his memory by praising him every chance I get. Masahiro Miyazaki, number one. He had the freedom of Lillooet. I think he got the Order of Merit from Canada. Yeah. Wonderful guy.
I have a question for you, Toby. I think one of the themes in the book is masculinity. And I think the book has an interesting way of kind of unpacking what masculinity is. And I was wondering if you had thought about that.
No, as soon as you say it,
I mean, I can see what you mean, because it is a young man's perspective, and I think also it was much more of a man's world at that point. But I'd have to be again,
Because my aunt, who's several years older than my dad, whenever she would talk about Lillooet, she had nothing positive to say. And her life started, as far as she was concerned, her life started when she, as a teenager, was sent to live in Vancouver, and she started working as a maid in a wealthy family's home in the Dunbar area of Vancouver. And after I read Dad's stories, I could really appreciate how different it was to be a female from a male at that time. And I could then understand why my aunt just wanted to blot out her childhood in Lillooet. Because her memories were things like knowing birthday parties are going on and being the one girl who wasn't invited. And so you're out on the street and all the other kids you know, especially the girls you know, are in somebody's house having a birthday party. And again, it comes back to that being, because you're poor, and so you're ostracized.
Well, if you were a reliever on welfare, that was a derogatory term. You were a reliever. And the war actually saved a lot of people from being poor. Because all of a sudden they needed everybody. And my brother, and if you look at the cenotaph down here, you'll find there are 12 names, young people from Lillooet, young men were sacrificed in the Second World War. But the same thing happened when Frank Brock was in the First World War. Here he came back to Canada. To me, he was a hero. To one of the storekeepers, he was a hero who always bought him a new uniform every year. But the people thought that he should be hunted down and killed because he shot a deer out of season. It's not I say ridiculous, but it's insanity. Insanity.
Yes.
Well, I grew up here, 27 years after that, and I came down to sliding hill.
Yay!
Well, I went from Tom Addison's a lot. He was really rich. He had such a fancy house. He had a really fancier house than anybody else did that I knew. But are you guys related to the UBC?
We think we are. So a few years ago, we were here just on a quick visit, and we bumped into one of the Whitney boys who was closing up the rec center. And we started chatting with him, and we realized we had the same last name. And so I said to him, we must be related. And so then a while after that, his mother, Terry, called me on the phone, and we talked. And then my dad put all the pieces together and realized that his dad's brother is...
Uncle Ed.
Yeah, Uncle Ed is related to that branch of Whitneys because Uncle Ed married an Indigenous woman. Yeah, and so we are related, but probably because my dad's side of the family left in 1939, the connection was lost. And also, when I've interviewed my dad about it, because of all of the racism, when he was attending school in Lillooet, his connection with those kids would be something that he wasn't proud of. So nobody would really want to emphasize that they were connected.
I was caught between a rock and a hard place. It was something that I didn't really understand, but it's sad that we have to go back in time and try to correct by writing stories and maybe taking political action sometime. But realizing and having other people realize that a great injustice was done to a lot of talented people. And fortunately, this guy, Miyazaki, fixed them permanently. Japanese.
I married a partner, friend here, and he had a job on the railroad. His brother, who looked totally native, couldn't get a job anywhere. That would be the early 1960s.
Yes. And in our family, there's 4 of us and we're all close in age. And when we talk about my dad, because we have the generation gap, right? We talk about his evolution. Like the way he talks about Indigenous people now is not the way he talked about them in the 1960s.
And
So-
I moved away for 46 years, and when I came back, I really still feel racism.
Well, there was, I heard this phrase, the only Indian is a dead Indian.
The only good Indian is a dead Indian.
Pardon me, the
That's
only
the
good
phrase.
Indian is a dead Indian. And that was, well, they say the same thing about the Japanese, the Chinese, I guess. Chinky Chinaman, right, sitting on the rails. Along comes the train and cuts off. That's terrible to say things like that about people.
7 years ago, and it hasn't really improved a whole lot. It looks like it has in the past.
Yeah.
Racism is still there.
Yeah, and we're hearing that in the news now, right? That's one of the themes that is coming up in Canada right now. You have your hand up.
Yeah, were there Indigenous kids in your school then, or were they all belong to residential?
I didn't hear it.
Did the Indigenous children attend school with you, or did they
Oh,
get
yeah.
sent away?
No, they were sent away when they were a certain age, but the half-breed children weren't sent away.
They came back and I was
So my dad uses the word carefully, half-breed, because from his generation, if you were of mixed heritage, and many people were, then you were called a half-breed.
Let me add to that. Look, the European people that came here, they came and they were living in this tough environment, and the smartest people they knew were the Indians. And if you wanted to get a smart wife, you married an Indian woman. Yeah, yeah.
But I think what he experienced as a child with school was that a lot of the children who looked Indigenous actually had one parent who was Anglo-Saxon. Those kids weren't sent away. They came to school. So they were in school with him. But there were other children whose both parents were Indigenous, and some of those children were obviously sent somewhere else. to
Well,
go to
Bobby
school.
Hurley, my close friend, the one I taught fishing to, he was about an 8th breed, you see. Way back in his family, there was an Indian wife. And then the family owned property, and I guess she was involved in the fortune of that family, but then they hid that. They didn't want anybody to know, you see.
Let me tell you why did Tom Hanson was such a nice home.
Who?
Tom Hanson, he had a beautiful home down there.
Well, the story, Tom Manson's story, Wendy Fraser has done a lot of research on it because she wrote a special for Remembrance Day a while back about the Manson boys and the war. And basically, Tom Manson was a descendant of some of the first pioneers in this part of BC, and they had property. And so he inherited, he outlived most of them, and he ended up inheriting the property. My dad described it as an orchard, but he is a descendant of some of the very first non-Indigenous people who came into this area and established themselves and had. Yeah, my dad always described him as a cowboy to us.
I took a photograph of Tom. It's in the museum. I think you've all seen it. Have you seen it? I posed him several times and made special copies and brought them back. And I think Hilda Halemer used to be one of the ladies that worked in the museum, and she took that picture and put it in the room that remembers all the different family groupings and the kind of house they live in. There's Tom's picture. I don't have a copy. It's too bad. I come back to Lillooet just to see Tom.
So in a way, Tom Manson is sort of like the black sheep in his family because he didn't marry. And like you said, he didn't have sort of that respectable lifestyle.
Well, he had to look after his mother too, you know. He had to look after his mother because she and he were the last two survivors on that farm. It was a beautiful orchard.
There's a question back here.
I just wanted to ask, when you said your grandparents were living on, correct?
Can you?
Yes.
Yeah, when did they come?
When did your grandparents come?
They came from the South Dakota after this First World War. My father came before them. My uncle came even before that, and they wrote back about how wonderful Lillooet was. And so my grandmother and grandfather decided to come here. They had saved some money from the Dawson Creek mining days, and they built this beautiful little property on the Cayuse Creek. And that was the place where I looked up and saw the stars. And they told me stories about where they lived in South Dakota. But they were just loving people. I was so lucky to be related to them because they made my life quite doable at times. So. I remember one time I had an accident in school. Who showed up? Granny. Took me away and she was cursing these people who don't look after children in schools.
What was their names?
Whitney.
No,
Sorry, Reynolds.
they were Reynolds.
Reynolds.
Harry Reynolds and Effie Reynolds. They're in the storybook.
I know what you're talking about, you couldn't see Whitney's down there.
Yeah, Effie and Harry Reynolds.
Effie Thompson married Harry Reynolds. And they came to Lillooet together from Dawson Creek.
And they
Dawson City.
Apparently, they had been involved in the gold rush up in the Yukon. And apparently there were these echoes of gold rush that happened in Lillooet, where in the 1920s, somebody found gold, and then this whole rumor went out that there was still gold here, and so...
When did they pass away?
When did they die?
Oh, Grandma died in 1933 when I was 8 years old. And her husband, my grandfather, died about 7 or 8 years later in Vancouver. He was only 70 when he died. I wrote about her death.
There's a story about her in the book. She never shed her American identity in her mind, and so there's one story in the book where
let me tell a bit about the story.
She's standing up at a softball game
Grandma
and criticizing
she weighed about
the Canadians.
250 pounds, and she'd stand up at the baseball games.
We can't-
And the people behind her couldn't see, though. I would yell at her, sit down, sit down, sit down. And she says, "You Canadians are stupid. I've been to church this morning, and I sang stand up for Jesus, and now you tell me to sit down for Christ's sake." Make up your mind.
I hope you're going to write more stories.
He's going to be 95 in December. Well, okay, actually, he just wrote another story, and he's going, in about a week from now, he's doing an interview with the New Westminster Museum, and you can register for it. It's Zoom because of COVID, and the story is about his friend, John Shintani, Kazumi Shintani. So when he moved to New Westminster, and he started to attend school there, he was also ostracized there.
We sat in the back, neglected.
Because the kids that he went to school with in New Westminster were all living around Queen's Park. They were quite wealthy. And my dad made friends with a Japanese-Canadian boy named Kazumi.
He was a Jap. Don't call him Japanese, that's not Canadian. Jap.
And he disappeared one Christmas
1942.
after Pearl Harbor because his family were rounded up and were sent up to the Kootenays in the camps, the internment camps. So the story is about the friendship they started and then it was interrupted, and how they accidentally met each other many, many decades later in a shopping mall in Vancouver. And they picked up their friendship and they became very close friends again. So that's what he's going to talk about. I think it's November 7th at that virtual event, and anybody who signs up is part of the event. So you get to interact and talk and ask questions as part of your participation in the event. And we gave this story to the Nikkei Museum in Burnaby, the museum that was built after the Mulroney government apologized to the Japanese Canadians. And so funds were given to the Japanese community to teach their history to Canadians. So they're going to publish that story in their own publication. So that he is still writing, but you know what? He has poetry that he's written. He's written poetry since he was a high school teacher, and he kept it all because he helped start the poetry club in the high school in Vancouver where he taught.
The Juggler.
And yeah, the magazine that they published at that high school was called The Juggler, and it's a poetry magazine. So he's ready to publish that. So that's probably what's going to be published next.
I'm going to be famous in my hometown. Yes.
Well, I think we've been here for more than an hour, right?
Well, we should.
We're going to go over there. We have more books, so if anybody wants to keep social distance but chat, we're going to be sitting at the table for a little bit longer, and we have more books.
I will say that Lillooet is well known in many parts of the world, I think. Lillooet, yep.
I don't want to stop sales, but we do have 2 copies in the library.
Yay. And so thank you so much for inviting us.
Well, thank you so much.